I was born in 1833. I died in 1911, 9 years after my beloved husband Josiah. We were first cousins once removed, but that was not unusual in those days because people didn't move around a lot and they didn't get transferred for their jobs, so most of the people that we knew were extended family. We had two sons, Julian, sometimes called Joy, and Gay, and we were a very, very happy family. Our family history actually started in, as far back as we can go, the 1700s in England. Some families moved to the eastern part of the United States to escape religious persecution. We moved to Rutland County, Vermont. Well, the families got to this country and they found out there was still religious persecution there. So they thought they'd move further into the Midwest to a place called Illinois. A group of people banded together and formed what they called a colony. And 72 stockholders purchased 17,000 acres in Bureau County, Illinois, which is up north where Princeton is now. About a year before the big group moved to Illinois, a few families decided they were ready and they went ahead and moved, and they settled here, near Washington. My husband's father, Dr. Gaius Wood, was one of those settlers. Now, my father-in-law had some interesting friends and relatives. One of his friends, actually a partner of his, was Dr. Russell T. Goodwin. And my father-in-law, Dr. Gaius Wood, and Dr. Russell T. Goodwin were developers in town. And if you live in Washington, I'll show you a map that will show you a green outline that is a neighborhood that still on the deeds would say Goodwin and Woods Addition. It is surrounded by Jefferson Street and Adams Street on the east side of the square. And if you know someone who lives in that neighborhood, that was developed by my father-in-law. Also, my father-in-law, Dr. Gaius Wood, had a sister. She was married to a man named M.S. Pearl. We do not know what the M.S. stood for. I tried to find out. But they must have been a rather unusual couple because even though they were married, they each owned his or her own house across the street from each other. So we might like to have that arrangement nowadays sometimes, but we don't usually. And her husband, M.S. Pearl, owned a saloon on the edge of Washington. Well, one night, a customer of the saloon, David Kelso, started home and he started feeling ill. And after a few hours, he got very ill and he died. His brothers and some of his friends decided that they were certain that he had been served tainted whiskey. So they formed a vigilante group and went out and burned the saloon down. And that saloon was the one that belonged to the uncle by marriage to my father, my husband, Dr. Josiah. Dr. Josiah Wood was the second oldest in his family, and I have to brag about him because he was so smart. We were quite a family that was interested in education, and Josiah became a teacher. And he became a teacher without any college education, so we were really proud of him. He was so intelligent that in 1862, Dr. Newton Bateman, who was the State Superintendent of Public Instruction, invited my husband to come to Springfield to take an examination. And if that examination is passed, the holder of that examination certificate is said to be, and I would like to quote, the holder of this certificate is said to have moral worth, thorough scholarship, and distinguished ability. This certificate meant that my husband could teach anywhere in the whole state of Illinois. Another part of Washington's education history that many people have never heard of is a school called the Washington Seminary. In 1858, a group of people built a building that was pretty much on the corner of South High Street and Catherine. South High is where the post office is, and it ends at Catherine. This building was built on 2 or 3 lots, and at first it was for speakers, lecturers, and special programs. Well, it must not have been too financially successful, even though Asa Danforth was one of the founding driving forces behind it, and that's a name you hear a lot in Washington. But 3 years later, in 1861, that building was sold at what was called a sheriff's sale. and that would be like a foreclosure auction. The group that purchased that building was Miles Andrews and Company. And then it was turned into a private school for boys, a Washington seminary. That's not the meaning of the seminary that we think of now, but it was a private school. There were other private schools in Washington just for girls. Young men came for this boys' school from as far as Deer Creek, which was quite a long way in those days by horseback. In 1879, again, not too many years later, evidently the school building had been neglected again. And in 1879, the local newspaper editorial said it was in such disgraceful condition that it either needed to be repaired or demolished. Well, the 3-story brick building with 60 windows was taken apart brick by brick during a month's project, so it was demolished. And that spot is close to where there's a big white house now that the Heipel family still owns. Telva Heipel Hunter was a student of my husband's, and she became a teacher. And she said one time, Dr. Josiah Wood was the best teacher I ever had. She said that in 1930. And another student of my husband, Emma Julia Scott, told the story about 2 young men, Daniel Unsicker and Daniel Minch, who were having a disagreement on the playground one day. Well, it came to fisticuffs, and my husband took them into the building, and he laid Daniel Minch over a chair, and he applied what we called then a shingle. Well, one of the girl students, Belle Monroe, thought that was pretty funny, and she laughed out loud. And my husband turned to her and said, Belle, any more of that out of you, and I'll give you the same. So he kept discipline also. The other exposure to my husband that some people in Washington had was enjoying him at social occasions when he played his violin. Our family moved to Minneapolis in 1883, but a few years later we came back to Washington, and that's why we're all here together. And I really thank you for coming to learn some of the history of the Wood family and also of the town of Washington and its education. Thank you.